On the 5th of October 1944, a United States Army Air Forces pilot named Martin James Monti did something that defied comprehension. He stole an American fighter aircraft, a Lockheed P-38 Lightning, one of the most advanced warplanes in the Allied arsenal, from an airfield in India, flew it across the Mediterranean, and landed it behind German lines in Italy. He then walked up to the nearest German military unit and offered his services to the Third Reich. In the final year of the deadliest war in human history, with the defeat of Nazi Germany becoming more apparent by the day, an American serviceman voluntarily defected to the enemy. His story is one of the strangest and most disturbing individual narratives of the Second World War, a tale of ideological conviction, psychological complexity, and a betrayal so complete that the American military struggled for years to determine the appropriate response. Martin Monti was born in Scientological Conviction, Louis, Missouri, in 1921, into a family of Italian descent. His background was, on the surface, unremarkable. He was raised Catholic, attended local schools, and showed no obvious signs of the radical political sympathies that would later define his life. But Monti grew up during the Great Depression, in a community where Italian-American identity was strong, and where Mussolini's Italy was viewed by some with a measure of admiration. Fascist Italy's propaganda efforts in the United States targeted Italian-American communities specifically, promoting the image of Mussolini as a strong leader who had restored Italian pride and prosperity. For some, in those communities, particularly those who felt marginalized in American society, the message found receptive ears. How deeply Monti absorbed these ideas during his formative years is a matter of speculation. What is known is that by the time he enlisted in the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor, his political views were already far outside the American mainstream. He harbored sympathies for fascism that went beyond ethnic nostalgia and extended into a genuine ideological commitment to the authoritarian politics of Mussolini and to some extent Hitler. He kept these views largely to himself during training and initial service, but they were the engine that drove him toward the most consequential decision of his life. Monti was posted to India as a replacement pilot in 1944, assigned to a unit operating transport aircraft. By all accounts, he found the assignment frustrating. He had trained as a fighter pilot and wanted to fly combat missions, not cargo routes. Whether his frustration was genuine or whether India was simply a staging post for a plan he had already conceived is impossible to know. What is documented is that on that October day, he gained access to a P-38 Lightning that was undergoing maintenance at the airfield, started the engines, and took off without authorization. He flew the aircraft across the Arabian Sea and the Mediterranean, a journey of well over 1,000 miles, and brought it down at a German-held airfield in northern Italy. The Germans were, unsurprisingly, suspicious. An American pilot arriving voluntarily in a state-of-the-art fighter aircraft was not something that happened every day. And the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, subjected Monti to extensive interrogation to determine whether he was a genuine defector or an Allied plant. Monti apparently satisfied his interrogators, and he was eventually recruited into the German propaganda apparatus. He was given a role in the production of radio broadcasts and printed materials aimed at undermining Allied morale, working alongside other defectors, collaborators, and propagandists in the increasingly desperate information warfare of the Third Reich's final months. Monti served the Germans until the end of the war, contributing to propaganda efforts that by that stage of the conflict were largely futile. The audiences for German propaganda broadcasts were shrinking, and the credibility of claims about German victory or Allied collapse was evaporating in the face of daily news of Allied advances. When the war ended in May 1945, Monti was captured along with thousands of other individuals who had been in German service. The challenge for the American authorities was determining what to do with him. The legal situation was complicated. Monti was an American citizen and an enlisted member of the armed forces who had deserted to the enemy in wartime. Under the strictest interpretation of military law, this constituted treason, a capital offense. But prosecuting treason cases is notoriously difficult. The United States Constitution requires either a confession in open court or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act. And gathering this evidence in the chaos of the immediate post-war period was challenging. The military initially charged Monti with desertion, a lesser offense, and he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years of hard labor. The sentence was later reduced, and Monti was dishonorably discharged. But the story did not end there. In 1948, Monti was rearrested and charged with treason, the more serious offense that his wartime conduct clearly warranted. The renewed prosecution reflected the hardening of attitudes in the early Cold War period, and a determination to hold accountable those Americans who had served the enemy. Faced with the evidence against him, Monti pleaded guilty to the treason charges and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He served his sentence and was eventually released, living out the remainder of his life in relative obscurity. The case of Martin Monti raises questions that go beyond the specifics of one man's wartime betrayal. What drives a person to abandon not merely their comrades but their country? To cross the most absolute line that military service recognizes, and to serve an enemy whose defeat was, by October 1944, all but certain. Ideology is the obvious answer, and it is likely the correct one. Monti's fascist sympathies were not a momentary lapse or a product of confusion. They were deeply held convictions that led him to see the Axis cause as morally justified and the Allied cause as wrong. In this, he was not unique. Every war produces individuals on both sides who cross the lines, driven by belief, by disillusionment, by personal grievance, or by some combination of all three. What makes Monti's case unusual is its transparency. Most defectors operate in the shadows, their stories emerging only years later through declassified files and academic research. Monti flew a stolen fighter aircraft across a war zone in broad daylight. There was nothing subtle about his defection, nothing that could be explained away as ambiguity or misunderstanding. It was a clear, deliberate, and public act of betrayal, and the straightforwardness of it is part of what makes it so unsettling. It is easy to understand treachery that is motivated by survival, by coercion, or by the moral complexities of espionage. It is harder to understand a man who chose freely, and at great personal risk, to join the losing side of the most consequential conflict in modern history, because he genuinely believed in what that side stood for. Monti died in 2000, at the age of 78. His story has never achieved the prominence of other defection and treason cases from the Second World War, perhaps because it lacks the narrative complexity of double agents and espionage, or perhaps because the straightforward nature of his betrayal makes it less interesting to those who prefer their history with shades of gray. But the case deserves remembering, not because Martin Monti was important, he was not, but because his story is a reminder that ideological commitment can lead people to act against their own interests, against the interests of their community, and against the cause of human decency, with a conviction that is all the more disturbing for being entirely sincere.